everybody, it's Romania Black, and it feels weird saying this, but we're on the last episode of Pluto. These 8 weeks have gone by so fast. It's kind of insane to me, and I don't know. It doesn't feel like I'm finishing a series at all. It really doesn't. There's been so much happening, and the thing about this series is I feel like there's so much more that could be explored. And that's kind of Urasawa's way, I guess, because I thought the same thing in Monster. I felt like even though it was 74 episodes, and even though it was spanning so long to watch, and still I felt like there were certain characters and certain plot lines, and I'm like, oh, you could have done more with that. But that's the nature of Urasawa's writing. Urasawa creates characters and creates a story where you just want to stay in that environment. You don't want to leave. You want to keep there and be with those characters and see more with them. And Urasawa's like, look, we don't have time. It's like, So I definitely feel that. I feel as if Urasawa could have taken so many of these storylines and so many of these characters, and because they're really well-written characters, he could have talked so much more about them, and I would have been on board with any of that storytelling. So it's really sad to know that we're ending the series this week. So when we last left off, Epsilon's dead. All the robots except Adam are dead, which should have been a sign, considering when this was based off of Astro Boy. I should have been like, oh, well, he'll be the last one standing, because I thought it was going to be Gesick. I thought it was going to be Gesick and Adam facing on Pluto and whatever Goji is and all of this, and Bora. I thought it was going to be Gesick and Adam at the very end together, if I'm being honest. When Adam died, I was like, he's not really going to die. No way. Not if they're basing this off of Astro Boy, he's going to live. That in itself is kind of a spoilery thing, to be clear. But I thought Gesick was going to live. I thought all the other robots were going to die. Gesick was going to be alive, and him and Adam were going to take on whatever was coming to face him, but nope. Nope. Gesick's gone. Epsilon's gone. All these characters are gone. It's just down to Adam and Iran, which I don't think Iran's going to be fighting anything, but it's going to be Adam. And the question is, Epsilon's sadness is what the personality spark that brought Adam back. It was Epsilon's sadness. So the question is, because it was sadness and not necessarily hatred or anger, is that going to affect him in a different way coming back? Is that going to have a certain impact? Tenma doesn't seem to think that wasn't what Tenma had intended, was for Epsilon to reach him. So what do we do with that? And how are we going to resolve things with Pluto, aka Sahad? How are we going to resolve things with Goji and Bora, who have barely been explored but talked about throughout this series? What's going to be the end result? And I don't know. Just like with Monster, I have no clue how this is going to shake out in the final hour. Monster, I'm not going to give anything away about the ending of Monster, but it's not an ending I predicted. So, and I don't really have any predictions with this one either. I assume Adam is going to fight Pluto, but whether he actually all the other robots have let Pluto live, whether they meant to or not. Gesick couldn't kill him. Epsilon decided he was going to, but then Bora came in and stopped that. The others have not been able to kill him either. Is Adam going to be the one to kill him? I don't know. Adam isn't quite as framed as a pacifist as Epsilon was. Epsilon was like the ultimate pacifist. He didn't want to kill anybody. He actively stayed disinvolved. He didn't want to do any of that. And then he saved the children throughout the rest of the story. For Adam, it wasn't that he wasn't fighting. He was just, because of how he looks, because of his stature and his ability, he was just framed as like a PR person rather than a soldier, because he didn't have the abilities that the others did have. So I don't know how that works. So the question is, like, Adam didn't really seem to have any, like, I mean, but I can't say that because he went to go fight Pluto, so he had some abilities to fight, so I can't say that he didn't. So we'll just see how this shakes out, but I'm super excited to see what happens. Before we start, I want to give a special shout out over to our philanthropy tier over on Patreon, because y'all have helped me be able to subscribe and watch this series, and that's been really helpful. So a special thanks to Alex Cornejo, to Anime Annie, to Be Happy, to Destiny Marie, to Danger Zone, to Davrin, to Danny Don Mai, to Dana, to Brian Reed, as well as Ichu, Eric, Hong Yehe, as well as Kiri, Elfreya, Lyndon, Matthew Palfinier, Murphew, Nicholas, Nameless Monster, as well as Ninths, Inlee 2, Sunspots, Trails, Shimoyama, and Translucent Men. Thank you all so much for all of your support. I greatly appreciate it. All of my love. So yeah, we got an hour. It's an hour and 7 minutes, but with the intro and conclusion, it's probably about an hour. So I am going to watch the intro this time though, because at this point, I don't think the intro is going to give anything away, but y'all, this is it. It's the last episode of Pluto. We're going to see what happens. So we're going to watch Pluto episode 8. Lucky number, rule of 8. Here we go. We're going to do that here in 3, 2, 1, and let's go. Wow. So that's it, huh? Oh my god. Oh my gosh. So all right. There was a lot that I really liked about that series finale. There was a lot that I liked about the ending of this. And there's just, I wanted to look up real quick. And I've looked up a little bit before starting this discussion because I wanted to talk a little bit about the Astro Boy series as we go through it. I didn't look up, obviously, the entirety of the Astro Boy series. Here's the thing. We're going to have a live stream discussion about this alongside Monster. I have it down. It is going to be the same time as Father's Day weekend, which, timing! So, we're going to be doing either the Saturday or Monday of Father's Day weekend here in the U.S., which is, it's either going to be June 15th or June 17th, one of the two, and I'll put on Patreon, and I'll put on Patreon as well as YouTube's community post, which it's going to be. But either June 15th or June 17th, either Saturday or Monday, because I'm going to celebrate Father's Day on Sunday, we're going to have a discussion of Monster and Pluto, and so I definitely want to talk more about it with you all then. And answer questions, what you have. And maybe by that point, I'll research a little bit up on Astro Boy as a series in relation to this so we can talk about it there in the discussion. So that's my goal anyway. But, however, with that being said, I did look up a little bit. I wanted to know just as a manga with Pluto, how many volumes. We were looking at a total of 8 volumes, right? Looking at the production of it. And obviously Urasawa is a huge fan of Tetsuka's Astro Boy, deciding to take on it, a serious take on the Greatest Robot on Earth arc, which was his favorite arc of the series. He felt there were some scenes that were missing or different than he remembered before realizing he'd created his own version of the story in his head, which is kind of cool, you know, because if you ever have like a story you read as a kid that you really like, oftentimes when you go back and read the actual story as an adult, you're like, oh, that wasn't exactly how I remembered it. And so I kind of like the idea that Urasawa took what he remembered from Tetsuka's story and kind of made this more adult, serious version of it here, which is a dark take on a children's classic. But here's the thing. I've not really talked about this on Patreon or Discord or YouTube at this point, but I'm working on a video essay about Tetsuka, which I didn't realize Tetsuka was the creator of this series as well, which is Unico. And I'm going to be doing a video about Unico, which is another Osamu Tezuka work, which I feel like it coming out around the time I'm finishing Pluto feels like a weird universal happenstance, so that's cool. But Tetsuka's work is kind of dark anyway. But here's the thing, it's designed for children. So Astro Boy as well as Unico are meant to be children's stories, but some of the takes on them have a very they have a dark flair to them, and they have kind of this very realistic sort of, oh, trust me, when we talk about Unico, there's some dark shit going on in that manga, and I was like, oh, this is for kids, okay. And so even though I feel like Urasawa tried to make a more adult version, in the end, he's still tapping on some of the same themes that Tetsuka was using, which were pretty dark to begin with. So it's like, yeah. He said, the Greatest Robot on Earth arc is not about being a righteous robot that took down bad robots. It's about the emptiness of war. And when I read it when I was 4 years old, I felt like I was being told a very deep story, something meant for adults. and I think everyone felt that way when they read it. It was never actually meant for kids. Yeah, it feels like something that, and there's certain aspects of Unico when I talk about that series that definitely feel like it's for the adults watching alongside the kids, being like, hey, you getting this too? And it's like, yeah, it's put in a very simple format to where kids can understand it, and it's not, so deep and complex, but at the same time it's meant for adults too, to be like, hey, I know I'm telling your kids this lesson, but maybe you should be listening too. So that also feels like what Urasawa is doing here, and we'll talk about it in the actual, when we go through the episode. But yeah, he's like, if you aim to properly adapt or remake any of Tetsuka's work, you're naturally going to end up with a very dark story. Yeah, so as far as the manga goes, there are different parts of the manga throughout this. It looks like Volume 1 talks about North Number 2 in Mont Blanc, which is the first episode. It feels like the second episode talks about, it feels like all of these are a volume per episode, which is so insane to me. I do like that Volume 4 ends with the greatest robot on Earth, which would be about the time that Tenma's like, this is what I was doing, creating the greatest robot on Earth, and that's Gesek. And then we end up, the last chapter is called The Greatest Robot in History. And so there you go. Also, one of the chapters is called Wish Upon a Star, which feels like the one where Pluto and Adam were like sitting there I like one chapter is called Gesek's Legacy. I honestly would like to go back through and read the manga on my own time, because I think that it would be, I love Urasawa's artwork, so I think it would be fun to read and just to go back through and kind of see how he does it. It just blows my mind that we only got an hour episode, and I might try to read some of it before the live stream to see like if there was anything left out of, to see if anything was left out of the anime. Interestingly enough, there was a stage play done for Pluto. How? Not how. I know pretty much how to be done, but yeah, interesting. So that's really interesting. So each episode adapts one of the manga volumes. Yep, awesome. And they started in May 2022. They confirmed it. Okay, cool. So yeah, I do remember they released this all at the same time, which is interesting. So cool. I want to talk a little bit about the Astro Boy series before we start out with this episode, though, since I pulled it up. If you don't know Osamu Tezuka, he's one of the most famous mangaka in all of Japan. I didn't realize he had done Unico, but his style is very evident. Like, once you see it, it looks very kid-friendly, the way that it's drawn, but it also has this kind of timeless charm to it. I feel like a lot of the information I've read about Tezuka said him and Walt Disney were very good friends, which checks out immensely, because they're both, like, these kind of like larger than life figures in the world of animation, one in the Western sphere and one in the Eastern sphere. So it only makes sense that they met at one point. And apparently Walt Disney in 1964 with Astro Boy told Tezuka he hoped to create something as powerful and long lasting as Astro Boy, which I don't think that he has. As much as we give credit to Mickey Mouse and things like that, I don't think story wise and depth wise he created anything like Astro Boy. So a feather in Tetsuka's cap especially. But the actual manga ran from 1952 to 1968 over 23 volumes, the original one. It's been adapted many, many times. Pluto is not actually the most recent adaptation. It is maybe anime-wise and animation-wise, but the manga actually came out in 2003. There's been other adaptations through like a Hong Kong American CGI film, as well as a manga prequel from 2014 that has came out before this series. But with it, some things to note are the fact that Ochanomizu is the professor. It's kind of like you have Dr. Tenma, that is the biological father of Adam, but he like rejects him for his own reasons and his own personal insecurities and trauma that he's dealing with. And Ochanomizu adopts Astro Boy, adopts Adam, and is the father figure to him. He's like that meme where it's like he's not the stepfather, but the father who stepped up. That's Ochanomizu in a glance, and I was all about him in this episode. But yeah, so basically it talks about how I thought the most interesting thing here is at the very beginning in episode 1, Adam mentions that he had been in a circus, and I was like, that's such a weird thing. But come to find out, that was a direct reference to the manga, in which Tenma sells Adam to a circus owner, because that's what great fathers do, right? They just sell their kids off to the circus. And Ochanomizu ends up getting him from the circus owner and treats him with kindness, which is kind of an interesting play on Pinocchio, because in Pinocchio, he spends some time in the circus. Only in that series, Geppetto doesn't sell him off. In that series, Pinocchio wanders off and ends up in the circus by his own accord, and it's not really Geppetto's fault. So there's that. At least in the Disney version of Pinocchio, that's the case. But like I said, Pinocchio is like one of my least favorite Disney stories, so not really interested in it. But I think that's very interesting that we have some actual legit characters from Astro Boy be personified. Clearly, Tenma was already very akin to Gendo before. What is so funny is I feel like Tenma from the 1950s Astro Boy inspired Gendo in Neon Genesis Evangelion, and that version inspired Urasawa to create his updated version of Tenma. So it was just this cycle. It's just this cycle of inspiration, and I feel like it all just came full circle, which is hilarious to me because there's a lot of Neon Genesis elements in this episode, particularly with the president of the United States of Thracia, that I was like, oh, the chair, the Shinji chair. It even has the same lighting, the same purple lighting. I was like, man, on the nose reference for sure. And I was living for it. So I think it's very interesting. I like the idea of Tetsuka created Astro Boy as, quote, to be a 21st century reverse Pinocchio, a nearly perfect robot who strove to become more human and emotive and to serve as an interface between man and machine. Which, here we go, right? Very interesting. Also, I think it's interesting that Tetsuka plays a lot of homages in a lot of his works with Astro Boy that tie back to certain Disney characters. I will say there is a note, because we're going to start out this episode talking about colonialism, which is, I mean, true stories, right? But I do think it's well worth noting, because I know a lot of people are like, Adolf, they're like, what, talking about native peoples and stuff. I will say this, from my research with Unico, and I will say this, no offense to Tetsuka, you are a manga legend, but I feel that just like with Walt Disney, was perhaps a little bit out of touch with talking about like indigenous cultures. And I'm a white person, so I don't really have much to say on this subject, but in Unico, and I'll talk about this in that video, there are some questionable choices that I'm like, ooh, that didn't age well at all. And they did note in the manga here that there were some choices in the manga that have not aged well. They're a little bit out of touch with the actual culture itself, but I do think that it is important to talk about such things. I'm not a fan of revisionist history, because I think that when we make mistakes as people, it should be, if you erase those mistakes like they never happened, they are doomed to repeat themselves, right? We're not learning anything from those mistakes. Instead, we need to call out those mistakes, make them known, and be like, hey, this happened. See how kind of problematic it is? Maybe we shouldn't do that in the future, and then not do it in the future. I think that's kind of the lesson that should be learned here. Luckily, I don't think Pluto really suffers from that, but with Unico, there's some choices that I'm like, okay. And they're not choices that are necessarily horrible, but they are choices that they don't age well. They're just kind of like, you're like, ooh, that was a choice. Maybe have phrased that a little bit differently, but I thought it was interesting to know here with Astro Boy, because I definitely see it with Unico, a product of its time. So yeah, that's interesting to note, but let's dive into this episode itself, because it was very interesting indeed. And we start out talking about what? Talking about these peaceful people that are tricked by the colonial white man that comes onto their land and offers them gold in exchange for all of. Here's my thing with it though. And again, I'm a white girl. I don't have a lot of clout to say in terms of this. I can't tell you. It feels very much like, again, United States of Thracia is a veiled reference to the United States of America. It feels a little bit like Tetsuka maybe wasn't completely understanding of the cultures of indigenous people, and he was just like, I don't exactly know the appropriate dress, the appropriate items, things like that, so I'm just gonna like throw a hodgepodge together, and you get what I'm saying. You get what I'm talking about. My thing is, I think he kind of like washes it over pretty gently in terms of putting onus on the colonists, because he talks about how the colonists were tricking the native people by exchanging gold, which the native people had no use for. They didn't trade or barter with it. First of all, the colonial people giving them gold, I was like, but why would they do that? Because the native people have no use for it. It's not of use to them. Whereas the colonists obviously find it to be, has currency meaning and value to them. So why would they just give it away? Right? But they're exchanging it for all their horses and everything. And they keep exchanging it for their horses till the native people have nothing left. Now, here's the part that makes it a little bit like eases the burden on the colonists. Because in reality, what happened was the colonists took all of their resources and then killed them all. They killed them, or they gave them disease, or they subjugated them and put them into slavery and moved them to another portion of the country. That's what really happened. But here, Tetsuka's kind of like, oh, well, no, the natives they got so upset because of all the bad decisions they made that they killed themselves. I was like, that's one way of I guess, doing it. I guess what I expected in that moment was for it to be that the colonists attacked them. And you kind of get like, it says they were people adrift from the world. And so they just went into the volcano, killed themselves, and then their spirits came together to be like this big slumbering spirit inside of the earth. And I was like, okay. So it's fine. I seem like I'm complaining about it. I'm not really complaining about it. I'm just kind of like, that's sort of the thing that Tetsuka does. That's sort of like, you don't want to come out and say that the colonists are murderers, but you don't also want to completely seem like the colonists are great people. So we're just going to have a middle ground. But I'm like, okay, so they all killed themselves. We'll go with it. We'll roll with it. It was just interesting in that moment. I was like, oh, that's not where I thought the story was going. So then we have it being Eden National Park, with Eden being like on the nose, being the Garden of Eden and the birth of evil, if you're going by biblical standards. But I thought that was interesting. The one thing that's kind of frustrating is in this final episode, everything comes together. And what's frustrating is some parts of it came together really well. And I was like, oh, that's such a great twist. I love that. That worked out really good. And other parts were just kind of either not explained, and I guess they're banking on you knowing about the original from Astro Boy, or they were just kind of abandoned. And you're like, that feels like that needed more to it, right? To get the full punch and effect to it, right? Because again, when you're dealing with only 8 episodes, your series doesn't really have a lot of time to breathe. So it's like, you better get that story in and make it count. And in some aspects, I think it really, really works. But there's a couple thread lines here that I was like, okay. And we're going to talk about it. And one I think was the fact that you had the ancient spirits, which you have the idea of all this collective hatred with all of the people that were tricked by the colonists, all the native indigenous people. You have their collective hatred. And I thought that was a really fascinating concept because it has no ties to robotics. It has no ties to robots or anything like that. And maybe that's why Urasawa kind of abandoned it. He was like, well, this doesn't really connect to my story. But then I'm like, then why have it to begin with, unless you're just setting the stage for Bora, and it just happens to be coincidence that you have Bora, this robot constructed through hatred, assembling to this place where there supposedly is this gathered hatred of all these indigenous people. I'm like, it's coincidence and it works, but I feel like Urasawa kind of gave up on that plot point. Like, we're not gonna connect it anymore. And I was like, I don't know if there could have been a connecting thing with that. I don't know if that would have worked or not, but it was interesting. It just kind of fell flat a little bit for me that, oh, this just happens to be where you're gathering. Okay. All right. I felt like maybe the spirit of the people was Bora, and maybe Bora was going to be like the embodiment of this human hatred versus a robot who has hatred in them. And there could have been something there, but it ends up not happening that way at all. So, okay. Okay. Another thing. The kid robot. We're going to talk about the kid robot throughout this whole thing, and that they've been conspiring all along to get rid of the robots, and the president of Thracia just happened to be working with Abula, but Abula seems to be against them. And I think the weakest plot line of this entire series for me is the kid robot in America. I mean, it's Thracia, but it's a veiled reference to the US. I was like, I thought the kid robot was a really cool concept and that they're this kind of third party antagonist that's kind of separated from everybody. But then nothing really happens to them. Like, even in the end, we're going to talk about Brow and the robot, that Brow ends up killing the robot. We're going to talk about that whole scene because that was cool in a way, but also frustrating. But I'm like, that's it? That this kid robot's randomly working behind the scenes, representing like Thracia and the greed of America against all this. But that was such a weak plot line to me because I was like, wait, so what are they doing? Why have they been there? What's their motivation? What's their backstory? And we get nothing. Not a thing. And I was like, oh, okay. I'm like, why are you a teddy bear? What's the representation? Why is there a chair? Shaft Studio, explain. I was like, what is... There just was not any explanation about the symbolism or any remote like reference. So I don't know if it's supposed to reference something from Astro Boy. I feel like the good thing about this series is, for the most part, I think you can watch it without knowing anything about Astro Boy, because I don't know anything about Astro Boy, just from what I've told you that I've read. So I think the good thing about Pluto is you can read it and watch it, and if you don't get the Astro Boy references, that's fine. But I feel like maybe there was stuff cut from the manga about this character and they just didn't have time to explain it. But also, some of the episodes of Pluto were shorter and some were longer, so I feel like you could have had time to throw it in there. But I don't know. This was the weakest plot point, was the kid robot. It was interesting, but it just fell flat for me that I was like, so why are you motivated to stop the robots? What beef do you have against them? It said that all robots that are similar in caliber feel the same. That part explaining was good because it explained why the robots were all able to feel each other's emotions and memories, because if you're of the same caliber, it's all connected. That part made sense. I'm glad we established that. I'm glad we explained that. But I'm like, but then the teddy bear robot in the chair seems to have had the same connection. So what's their story? What do we get with them? Why aren't you telling us, Urasawa? And I guess I'm more critical because, having just watched Monster, where it was 74 episodes and even a character that appeared for one episode only, Urasawa fleshed them out in so much detail that you felt like you knew their entire backstory by the time the episode was over. And you were like, oh, awesome. I know everything about this character. Even if I never see them again, they have a fully fleshed out story. And so for Urasawa to introduce this teddy bear robot with Thracia, and for them not to really get any sort of explanation, they're just a random antagonistic force that's off in the distance, but doesn't ever really... The only time it connects with Adam is when he looks in the mirror and he's like, don't piss me off. And the child robot's like, oh no, he's alive. And then Brow comes in at the end and kills him. That's it. And I'm like, cool, but what else? So it felt like you didn't even need the child robot, is I think what's most frustrating. That whole plot line with Brow at the end and the president and the child robot, you didn't even need it. You could have just said Abula wanted to kill the 7 robots and had Pluto do it, because that's essentially what happens. You didn't even need this plot line. You didn't even need the child teddy bear robot. It was kind of needless. I guess it just didn't need to be there. The only reason it's there is to somehow weirdly make Brow kind of an anti-hero at the end, which I'm like, we'll talk about that scene. I'm like, I think there was a different way you could have done it, but I was like, what? But we didn't need any of this. Like, it just wasn't necessary. I mean, you could show the president's a douchebag without the teddy bear robot, and we'll talk about it when we get to it. So then we go to the Garden of Eden. Of course, I do like the commentary where it talks about the people like looking in on the monks. And it is not lost on me, the direct commentary of the tour guide going through these people's homes and being like, look at these weirdos. And I'm like, that's like, these people are, talking about the end of days. Maybe you should be paying attention to them. I was like, ooh, okay. Yeah, it felt very on the nose, and a direct reference to how in modern days we're so obsessed with like commercialization and entertainment that we're not paying attention to our own environments around us, which is a very on the nose and very needed commentary. So I'm glad that Urasawa makes that, because it's pretty important. We should talk about that. So, oh my God, I am glad that Adam did not turn out to be a murder machine, because the concept of when he started writing down the atomic bomb formula on the side of the wall was absolutely terrifying. And I'm like, oh, okay, cool. And I was really worried in that moment, as Ochanomizu is, that he's going to do something drastically bad with that information and that he could blow up the whole world with this knowledge. And Ochanomizu has to step up and be a dad this episode, because Tenma is certainly not doing that. And I just love Ochanomizu. I gave Ochanomizu a hard time in the beginning of the series because he was very trusting and he just let people in. And I was like, shouldn't you be a little bit more cautious? But now what I like that Urasawa does is that we see the payoff of that, where yes, Ochanomizu is trusting and he does have faith in people and he has faith in humanity and he is not tainted by, judgment and hatred and things like that. And while it can be seen as a problem, I like that Ochanomizu by the end shows that being trusting of others and having faith in humanity is like one of the best things you can have, because it leads to stopping the cycle of violence and hatred, or at least recognizing it and becoming aware of how to deal with it. So I was like, okay, all right, show, you got me. You got me on Ochanomizu. I'm here for him now. I get it indeed, right? So meanwhile, rather than solve the problems that are in front of him, Tenma goes to literally everyone else. And I'm like, Tenma's also definitely Frankenstein, like just creating robots left and right and messing with things he probably shouldn't be messing with because he has this empty void in his soul and needs to go to therapy. But him going up to Brow, you know what? Poor Brow. I say this, he's a serial killer robot. We shouldn't say poor Brow. But this entire series, he's just been sitting there with like a lance in him, and he's been waiting for someone to like come and talk to him, and everybody comes and talks, asks him questions. He's like, you're not gonna ask how I'm doing? I do question, like, at the very end, Brow somehow makes it to America, or Thracia, somehow makes it to Thracia, somehow waddles his way in to kill the teddy bear robot. Like, if he could do that the whole time and the lance was stuck in him up until the end, like, I thought the lance was keeping him stuck to the robot. And I thought he made the reference that if you took the lance out, he'd die. So he takes the lance out and kills the teddy bear robot. So then does he die? What? How did he get to Thracia? Who let him out? Did Tenma take him over there? How did he not die along the way? Because I thought he couldn't go anywhere or he would die. How can he move? Why didn't he get out earlier? If he wasn't going to die because the lance was still stuck in him, and if it wasn't sticking him to the rock and he was just connected to those tubes, he's not connected to the tubes when he leaves. So how does that explain? I'm like, the whole Brow and teddy bear storyline, it just doesn't seem like it needs to exist in this series. You could take that out. It doesn't change anything. The only thing it changes is that the teddy bear robot can't take over the United States of Thracia, but you didn't need that to begin with. I think you could have just played it as, you could have had Tenma talk to the president of the United States of Thracia and have them have a conversation and get just the same amount of information done. Instead, you somehow take this serial killer robot and make him somewhat of an anti-hero because he destroys the worser evil of the two, I guess. That part was just completely lost to me. I don't think you needed to have it. I think unless there was a lot extra in the manga that just wasn't adapted, I think you'd have cut that whole ending storyline, and you could have cut the whole ending you could have cut the whole teddy bear robot subplot, because other than being kind of a red herring, it really just didn't have much overall bearing with the story. And in Monster, to Urasawa's credit, in Monster, there are some storylines that don't go anywhere. But again, you've had 74 episodes with these characters that there's enough subplots and enough plot lines that the stuff that doesn't necessarily go anywhere, you kind of can look back on and go, oh yeah, well, it wasn't going to go anywhere to begin with. That was just me expecting it. But here, they played up that teddy bear robot like it was going to be some real big important plot point, and then it just didn't have anything to do. And I was like, okay. But yeah, Brow's just here to torment Tenma. And he's like, I want to ask you a question. And Brow's like, everybody wants to ask me a question. Meanwhile, Ochanomizu's putting the work in to actually figure out what's going on with Adam and to try to help him. And he's like, what you've done to this poor boy is inexcusable. Yeah, I mean, did it have to be hatred and suffering? You know what? Say what you will about hatred and suffering needed to make the robots act on their own. I get the logistics of it, but still, like, in a sense, you had Timma kind of violating Adam by forcing him to take on a certain perspective and a certain personality, like injecting an emotion that Adam did not necessarily need or want into his system and forcing him to take on a personality fueled by hatred when Uchanamizu's like, you're just repeating the cycle. What we doing? Thank God it was Gesick that was put into Adam. I guess the one good thing Tenma does do is give him Gesick's memories, because Gesick is a practical saint. And we finally get the full circle with his storyline, which I was glad to see Gesick in this. I was really sad we weren't going to see Gesick anymore. I'm glad that he's actually the reason that Adam doesn't become a murder machine, is Gesick. So, our patron saint of robots, the greatest robot on Earth, right? So yeah, he just goes around, and meanwhile, Tim is just like wistfully being like mysterious, and it's like, why don't you step up and be a dad? I'm glad that they, at least to know that in the original series, Tenma's not a nice person either. He sells his kid to a literal circus. So it's like, oh, so he wasn't really a good person to begin with. Another thing that I'm kind of sad about is that Iran, and I'm not mad at the story for Iran in this moment, because Iran's character, I'm not mad at Urasawa for this, because me personally, I would have liked Iran to have had some more bearing at the end of the story. Like, we don't even get to see her like reconnect with Adam after she only sees him when he wakes up. We don't even get to see him like at the end. You just kind of have to imagine what that reunion's going to be like. And the thing with Helena, I'm glad that he does end up living so he can go see Helena again, and that's hinted at, so that's nice. The one thing that kind of salvages Iran for me at the end is that Sahad does say that he wants Adam to go back and tell Iran that he was grateful they got to like paint the flowers together, and he was grateful for her kindness. Her kindness was kind of like, she was nice to me, and that had an impact. Because, not gonna lie, Tenma last episode, Tenma kind of shoves her off to the side and is like, oh, silly little girl robot and your emotions of kindness, who needs that? I'm like, bitch, that saves the day. That literally saves the entire story. I'm like, yeah, because what would have happened, because, I mean, the whole point of it is that hatred begets hatred, and that is bad. And if Adam had killed Pluto, he would not have been able to stop Bora, and the world would have been destroyed. Because he's kind, because Gesick and Iran's kindness reach him, that allows him to spare his life. And because all the other robots are like, hey, we know that Pluto killed us, but killing him is not the answer. It's not going to solve anything. And then because he ends up hearing all of those voices and acts in kindness, it literally saves the world. Tenma's actions were just going to doom the world to eternal darkness and destruction. And I'm like, dude. So, and the thing that can be so frustrating is I don't know if Tenma learned his lesson. And I guess that's supposed to be left up to us, the audience, to decide if Adam's going to be like, hey, Dad, what's up? Still here. Or if he's even going to recognize Tenma as his father, because Tenma doesn't recognize Adam as his son. He says his son Tobio's dead, and he doesn't recognize him as his kid. So I think that's why at the very end, Adam is with Ochonamizu, because Ochonamizu's like, I'm literally your father figure, not him. Not Dr. Frankenstein. There is a part of me that would have liked Adam to have confronted Tenma, but I don't know if it would have done any good based on Tenma's character. And maybe that's the point, is that Adam's just like, let this old man go. But we'll talk about Ochonamizu's conversation with him later on. But yeah, Tenma's like, yes, I uploaded him with Gesick's painful last moments. He's like, I made it to where he would just feel pain. And Ochonamizu's like, that was a bad idea. Why'd you do that? And so, of course, Brow's like, okay. Like, he's just staring at Tenma like, that was a choice. So yeah, and then him running after him and him looking over. He looks at himself in that moment and says, listen up, I wouldn't even think about pissing me off. And that's when it goes back to the child robot. So again, how are they connected? What's the point of the child robot? We don't ever find out, which is frustrating. which is very frustrating. Another thing that's frustrating is that the president of Thracia, they have this conversation about, well, do robots feel hatred? And I'm like, we're on episode 8. I'm like, we're on episode 8 of 8. And at this point, you're questioning something that we learned back in episode 4. What we doing, show? What we doing? Like, I feel like that should have been acknowledged way earlier. I do love the design of this, like, red heart that is like the robot in the center of the city. I do, in the center of Thracia's capital. I do love the design of it. It's very futuristic. It's very creepy. The teddy bear seems to be a physical representation, manifestation of it. I like it. I'm also glad for a hot second I thought that Adam was going to destroy the damn snail. And luckily we have a good full circle moment with him so that he doesn't crush it. Right? I so glad that he didn't crush that damn snail. And for a hot second, I was worried that the whole message of the story was going to be like, oh, you need monsters to fight monsters. You need violence to fight violence. And I'm like, well, Monster as a series by Urasawa has shown us that's not exactly true. So maybe Urasawa is going to back that up in this series. But, you know, sometimes when mangaka get older, sometimes they get more jaded or they get more, like, grandfatherly. And I was like, is Urasawa going to get more jaded and be like, no, violence? Or is he going to be more grandfatherly and be like, actually, no. And thank God he gets more grandfatherly. I was like, okay, good. But, yeah, the best part about this episode was, by far, finally getting the full circle understanding of the kid robot and everything with Gesek. That is one thing that I do like about Urasawa, is that he will set something up sometimes and the payoff, it's not what you expect, but it's even better than you expect. And that part with Gesek and the child robot, I was like, oh, it all makes sense now. The idea that he saved the kid that was being held hostage, the idea of him, like, asking the kid to trust him, and then him being like, and then the father being so, like, happy to see his son again. And Gesek's like, I don't understand why he would say something like that, because he's a robot. And the man that's 500 Zeus a body was giving him the little robot whose AI was outdated. And he took it home like it was a child. And he's like, no, he's like, give me the child. And him, like, holding it like it's so, like, tender and it looking up at him. And he's like, well, it's nothing but junk. And then he says, I'll make you a deal, 500 Zeus a body. And we finally get confirmation. And him, like, holding the little baby robot all in those swaddling cloths with its little short circuit eyes, like, leaning up against that. Oh, my heart. Oh, my heart. It was just so sweet. And then them both, like, he's saying, and they act just like a pair of real parents. Where he's like, watching this tiny miracle walk towards me step by step. That's exactly the thing a parent would say to their kid. And then the kid calls them mom and dad. And it's like, okay, all right, Urasawa. It's all come full circle now. It all makes sense. And it makes sense now why them loving this kid would drive him to kill Adolf's brother. Because he murdered their child. Robotica. Yep. And then I do like that we get one more moment with Adolf where he's like, I'm afraid of myself now that I've learned how to hate. And does it ever go away? And for Adolf to take the step to, like, say this to him, I think is pretty relevant to his character. Where he says, I don't know if hatred ever goes away, but I do know that I don't hate you now. And I think that's such a, like, I love the way that Urasawa tells that to us in such a nuanced and layered way of saying that, no, hatred doesn't go away. It's always going to be there. And that's kind of the thing, too, is, like, hatred is always an emotion that is part of us being human. That's part of our humanity. If you got rid of it, you would be a robot. So that's not possible. However, it does not have to be the emotion that controls you. It doesn't have to be the emotion that drives everything you do. And it's an emotion that just creates more of itself. So if you hate others, they're going to hate as well. And it's just going to be this cyclical cycle. And I feel like having watched, like, Attack on Titan, having watched Monster, having to watch other series where hatred is a talked about concept, the mangaka are definitely like, we have to keep telling people this because people don't get it. And we have to keep on spreading the word. The idea that, because it is frustrating when people are like, oh, you should have killed him in the comments. And I'm like, one, it is very hard to take a human life, even though people say how easy it is. It takes a toll, and they talk about it in these series. And two, it's like, that's not the point. The point is, if you take a life, you're just making the situation worse. And I like that Urasawa, as kind of predictable as it is at that point, by the end of the series, by the end of this episode, I was like, okay, he's not going to kill Pluto. And then I was like, oh, I was trying to, in my head, as he was going to fight Bora, I'm like, well, how is he going to fight Bora if he's going to incinerate on the spot? And then I'm like, oh, well, Pluto's going to come in and fight him because he saved Pluto. That's what's going to happen. And that seems rather simplistic, but also Urasawa is adapting a kid's story. So at the very end, unless you're going to fundamentally change everything about it, there's probably going to be some elements of it that you're like, no, yeah, that makes sense. We're telling the story to kids. We're just updating it for adults. So yeah, while I'm sure some people were like kind of maybe didn't care for how simplistic the message was, I'm like, well, he is adapting a children's story, and I think that he did it as effective as he could. I still just don't understand the Brow and Teddy Bear plot at the end. I was like, it just didn't feel needed. But yeah, I like the idea that you don't have to let hatred control you. And then we see from Gesick, he could have shown hatred and violence towards Pluto and towards Ali, but he didn't. Even at the cost of his own life, he didn't further that cycle of hatred. And that inspires Adam to kind of snap out of it. And I'm glad that Adam is his own person. I'm glad he's not Gesick. I'm glad that he's not just, Gesick's AI is what was used to kind of be the catalyst to wake him up. He had a specific person's AI wake him up. The thing was, Tenma thought that Gesick was going to be filled with all this hatred, and that was going to transfer to Adam, and Adam would just be full of hatred and destroy everything. But what Tenma did not account for was that Gesick would have this love and compassion in his heart, and that would shine through beyond the hatred. And I'm like, yes, please. All of these things. Thank you very much. And just Ochana Mizu being like, Ochana Mizu just giving him a hug despite everything. I'm like, he's like, oh, I've missed you. I'm like, literally his dad, literally his father figure. I freaking love Ochana Mizu. He's such a great father. And then Brow says the hatred is gone. There's no sign of it. And then Tenma, being a negative Nancy over here, is like, well, hatred and sorrow never leave you once they're in you. And I'm like, yeah, no shit, Sherlock, but they don't have to be your driving emotions. Go to therapy! Hence their power. One may think they've burned themselves out, but the embers never truly grow cold. And I like the Brow's just laughing like, oh my god, you need therapy so bad, dude! Just get out of here. Brow's like, cool, fair point, but like, get a check. He's like, there's still something I want to ask you. The entire reason I came here. And he's like, where can I find Abula? I like that Brow knows where all these people are. Like he's sitting in a cellar somewhere. How does he have all this information? How does he have, what computer does he have to go off of? What scanners does he have running? Why does everybody go to him for questions? I'm like, he's a serial killer robot trapped in the bottom of a cellar. What does he know? Just like, what? And I like that Brow's like, Magic 8-Ball answer, that guy's going to come to you because he's going to want you because you're the robotic scientist. So just wait and they're going to come find you. I don't know what else you want from me. And then I did think it was an interesting trick that the Roach robot used the laser to like knock Tenma out and take him to Abula. But anyway, we cover all of the things that go on. We finally find out that the dead cellar robot, that they were trying to originally use Bora to do what Sahad wanted. So basically, Sahad and Bora were originally tasked with the same. Sahad had the idea of spreading flowers throughout the desert there in Persia, and Bora was going to be the instrument to help Sahad accomplish that task. But neither of them worked properly or were able to accomplish their goal, hence all of the different versions of Sahad and Bora that were in the cellar that they were trying to dispose of to hide what they were actually trying to do. Which, whatevs. I'm kind of like, I don't know why you wanted to hide something that was trying to do something like make flowers, but all right. I guess because the power that it had was strong enough to be a weapon of mass destruction, even though that wasn't the intent of it. But I think probably one of the best surprises in this that worked really, really well. Also, them, like when Abula shows up with Tenma and they lower down into the cellar, that walkway is Neon Genesis. That is the same damn walkway that is in Neon Genesis Evangelion in the lab where Gendo works. It's the same thing. And I was like, yes, give us those NGE references. But the best plot point that works so well here is when Abula is like, I'm going to have you put my brain inside of the robot. And I was like, oh, okay, you're going to go full robot. And then Tenma's like, you're already full robot. I was like, ah, it makes so much sense now. It all comes together. That's probably one of the better twists of the series, is that Abula has been a robot the whole time. He just didn't know it. And it's like, bitchin'. Okay. He's like, you're the greatest AI, not Sahad. Sahad wasn't the one that I woke up with hatred. Sahad's just your son that you generationally inflicted generational trauma upon, so he'd have the same hatred. But he's not the one that woke up. You are. And it's like, I was like, that's such a... And see, that's why I don't think we needed the bear robot, is because you could have Abula wanting to kill the other robots, and using Sahad to do that, because that's what ends up happening anyway. No, Huckleberry. And that was enough. You didn't have to have the other plot line. He's like, you haven't been a human being since the war. And the fact that he died. And that... but here's the thing. Tenma is the reason for all of this. Tenma is the reason all of this went down. If he hadn't recreated Abula with the hate chip, with the chip with his hatred in it, if he hadn't have done that, then Pluto wouldn't have been a thing. Then the other robots being killed wouldn't have been a thing. They were talking about Persia bouncing back. Things were starting to go fine. Tenma is like the reason all of this went down. And it was only because he has all of this insecurity and self-hatred in his own heart and thought that this was the only way things would work. And I'm like, the classic Malcolm case from Jurassic Park where he's like, you had all this ability and knew that you could, you didn't stop and think if you should. It's like, yep. And then here we go. And he's like, yep, I made you, and that's been the problem this whole time. And then going back and him being Goji this whole way. What's interesting with me, and the one thing that's kind of weird, is I get the idea that Abula has been Goji the whole time, because I'm like, they've all been connected. Goji and Bora, Abula and Pluto, they've all been the same individuals involved this entire time. That all makes sense. What was the deal with the one robot that said he was Goji that went and saw Ochanamizu? What has been this? And also, Tenma's a freaking liar, because when Ochanamizu's like, do you know about Goji? And Tenma's like, no. I'm like, you're a liar. How dare you, sir? So yeah, it's cool if you like Tenma's character, but Tenma's character is so flawed and is such like the instigator of all of this and actually the antagonist of the story. He's like Gendo in Neon Genesis. Basically serves the same function. Basically serves the same function. He is literally Gendo 2.0. The roaches are still creepy. I don't like them. And they established that he's literally this bomb that's gonna blow up. I like that they're like, oh, well, there's a chance that there's a chance we'll be okay. There's a chance we're gonna be all right. We just have to make sure this bomb, like a bomb, doesn't blow off with the magma. And then lo and behold, there's Bora. So one thing that was lost on me at first is that we cut from Darius in the chair to what appears to be Darius in the chamber waiting as the bombs are going off. I didn't take into account that that was Darius from back then, but apparently it was when Abula found him. So that makes more sense now. And the reaction, I didn't realize that they were one and the same. And so Abula takes him down to see Pluto and shows him, and he's like, I want you to destroy all the robots. Well, I'm like, again, we didn't need the teddy bear robot. This whole plot line answers that question for us. We didn't need the other one, which was not necessary. But now I have the United States of Thracia that's there. And as if it could not be a more veiled reference to the U.S. As if it could not be. And he's like, oh, like a volcano? And he's like, yes, Mr. President. And he's like, an eruption is certain at this point. It's going to happen where Eden National Park is. And so then Arnold, bless his heart, Arnold's like a secret little MVP of this entire series. He's like, this weather robot can give you all the details. And I love that he's like, my name is Arnold, sir. Again, talking about prejudice against robots. What can we do? But yeah. And they're like, are we safe or not? And they're like, no, well, we kind of are in a lot of trouble. So yeah, and then the United States of Thracia, who's being simultaneously controlled by this robot, surprise, surprise, goes at there and is like, well, you didn't tell me about all this. I don't know if it's supposed to be making, I mean, obviously it's making fun of the president of the United States of Thracia, who's kind of a veiled George Bush reference, because this came out in 2003. It's a veiled reference. But I don't know if Urasawa is directly poking fun at him and saying that he takes advice from this teddy bear like robot. I'm sure that's poking fun in a lot of ways. It's supposed to be meta. But it's just, it's humorous in itself. And the robot's like, well, don't worry, all the robots are going to survive the apocalypse, but you won't. And I was like, that part was interesting, because I'm like, yeah, the robots are like, well, yeah, sure, we might all die, but we'll probably survive. You guys just won't. It's okay. And that's when Adam's like, well, I'm going to do something to stop this. And that's going to be the case. The one thing that I'm sad is that in Adam's series of goodbyes, he doesn't go and talk to Iran. And I know why. He doesn't want to get her riled up, because then she's going to be upset. But I'm just like, that's your sister, and you didn't go talk to her before you possibly died. That kind of sucks. Instead, he goes to Brow. And I'm like, everybody goes to Brow. Everybody goes to Hannibal Lecter Robot for reasons. And so he's like, you must have noticed the enemy. And he's like, I certainly did. And what does he say here? He talks about the little kid. He's like, I'll honor your request. Consider it done. He's like, sure, go stop this robot from creating more havoc. And then he asks to touch his hand. And I do kind of like the subversion, because I thought it was Brow tricking Adam. But he's been trying to touch Gesick and the others this whole time. And everybody keeps saying no and denying it to Brow. And so I do feel like when Adam touches Brow's hand and there's this warmth, that there again is this concept that even people who have killed, even murderers like Brow, treating them with like humanity and kindness has an effect. Because in the end, Brow doesn't kill the president. And I feel like that's directly because of Adam reaching out and giving him that compassion, that he pays it forward by not killing the president. That's like the direct correlation. Whereas before, Brow kept reaching out to Gesick and the others, and none of them would touch them because they're like, oh, no, you're a killer. And having watched a lot of simulations with mediation before, which is something that I did during school, there is a concept of even people that have done horrible things are not above acts of humanity. They're not above acts of compassion. They're still humans at the end of the day. They make mistakes. Tenma is a prime example, but at the end of the day, they do deserve to have a wake-up call, which Tenma does get from Ochiana Mizu, but do deserve at the end of the day to not be completely ostracized and abandoned. And that's why I kind of wanted Adam to confront him, so that he wasn't just abandoned, because by the end he seems like he's just abandoned in that warehouse. And I wanted Tenma to get some kind of, not necessarily comeuppance, but I wanted him to get some kind of interaction at the end from Adam, but we don't end up getting that. So then we do get Helena and Adam to share this moment. I also like that Adam's kind of like, no, Gesick didn't lie to you. He really doesn't know about the memories that you had erased. Although at this point, it's pretty clear that the memories that were erased were of him killing Adolf's brother. And that whole deal about the kid and everything, which at this point it isn't. Again, if Helena knew that, it would just further the cycle of violence. So it's best if she doesn't know. It's not going to change anything. Adolf's brother's dead. What good's it going to do to know now? And Gesick and her have these fond memories of their child, so it is what it is. I am sad for Helena, though. I want her to end up being happy, and maybe Adam can go visit her now. So we go to the grave of Gesick, the greatest robot in Europe, policeman who died fighting for the peace of mankind. I kind of wanted Gesick to stick out towards the end and be the one to kind of solve it, but again, this is based on Astro Boy, which is a Japanese story, so are we going to have the German robot save the day and the Japanese robot die? No, we're going to have the Japanese robot save the day. And that ties into Tenma. So it all thematically makes sense now. That Gesek can't be the one to save the day. It is what it is. I just wish that Gesek could stay alive. But again, he was too close to Adam thematically here. Can have two. So yeah, we have the fight between Pluto and Adam. I do think that Pluto was a bit more menacing towards the beginning of the series, but that's kind of the point. Again, the idea is that as time goes on and we learn more about Sahad and we learn more about Pluto, he's not as menacing and terrifying as in the beginning when we didn't know much about him. It's the idea of the unknown, and that it's easier to hate the unknown when you don't know as much about them. But when you get to finally know the individual and you get to know their backstory and their history, then you start to relate more to them. And then you're kind of like, oh, well, I don't really want him to kill him now that we know all of this. And he's not as threatening or scary as before. And that's kind of the point. Because by the end of this, Adam is going to let hatred consume him. But the other robots, as well as Iran, are like, no, don't be what they were going to be. Like, that's going to be a disservice to their memory. They're like, we didn't abandon our hatred and live these peaceful lives just for you to just recreate the cycle. And I love that. I love that Adam doesn't end up killing him. And then Pluto crying. Pluto crying was really sad. It was really pitiful. You're just like, oh no. But then, you know, it's Sahad. Deep down inside. And he was just trying to connect to somebody. And it's the idea of these two robots having these human emotions. It is a little humorous when it jump cuts to them like under the stars together. I'm like, don't we have a volcano about to erupt? But then one, they're waiting on Bora to get there. So what else can they do? And two, I'm sure that in the manga, this was the start of a chapter. It felt like the start of a new chapter. The scene where they're watching the stars. And I was like, okay. Like, that part all kind of makes sense. But I was just like, it's almost humorous that it's a jump cut because we're on, like, a timer at this point. I did think it was a little bit cheesy that Abula was going to time the end of the world to the anniversary of his family's death. I know it's symbolic, but the moment they said he was timing it to the time of that, I'm like, well, they're going to stop it before it happens. And I was like, good deal. That was just a choice. It works, though. I was curious to know what Adam was going to do when he was like going up to the sky. It was very Superman. I didn't know if he was going to try to like do something with the atmosphere, but that doesn't end up happening. So then we have Tenma and Ochanomizu's like confrontation. And this is probably my second favorite part of the episode. This is probably my second favorite part of the episode in terms of what ends up happening. Because we have Tenma. Tenma just shows up. And I'm like, bitch, you didn't have to show up. Ochanomizu is getting ready to go be the dad figure that you're not being and try to help out Adam. And you're just off in a bunker somewhere, huddled down, waiting for the end of the world. I'm like, you don't have any faith in Adam that he could do anything but have hatred because that's all you know. And like, he didn't have to call Ochanomizu. He doesn't offer Ochanomizu really any important information. He's just there to kind of rub it in his face. It's the end of the world. And they're like, do you think Pluto could have killed him again? And then Tenma just chimes in saying, well, Adam's now stronger than he was during their first fatal encounter. And he's like, as a result of the unbalanced emotions that I infused in him. And I'm like, we already know this, Tenma. You're just rubbing it in to make it seem like, you know, you're responsible for Pluto's death, which you're not. And then Ochanomizu's like, well, but is he strong enough to do anything? It's like, the odds are that Adam's already slain Pluto. And I'm like, so you just thought your kid was going to act out in hatred. Cool. And Ochanomizu's like, I don't think so. Bora's the real threat, gentlemen. He will end life on Earth as we know it in minutes. Even Adam cannot stop him. And I'm like, well, then what was the point of bringing him back? I'm like, Tenma, if you didn't think that Bora could be stopped and that Pluto was there, what was the point? And I'm like, I'm glad that Tenma's wrong. And Ochanomizu's like, look. I like when he lands, he's like, well, I'm not giving up on this kid. He's like, we've touched down. He's like, there's no time to waste. And then, I like the one guy trying to offer the helmet to Ochanomizu, and he's like, look, I haven't been cautious with my body this entire series. Why would I put on a helmet now? I'm like that the guy kept on his helmet. And then Timma being the most antagonistic. He'd be like, well, the air outside your ship is filled with malice. And I'm like, well, it ain't radioactive. I think we'll be okay. Abula's hatred eats away at all other emotions and radiates off of him like never before. And I like that Oshana was like, look, your problems are your problems, not mine. Like, go handle yourself. He's like, Bora is that hatred made manifest. And Oshana he's like, the earth is doomed no matter how you may try. And Oshana like, yeah, that's a theory, sir. He's like, no offense, but you spend too much time in your lab. You need to touch some grass. He's like, you need to touch grass, Tenma. You need to get some more sun on your face a little bit more often. Have a little bit more faith in humanity, sir. Hypothetically, you're correct. The Earth's doom is upon us. But we're all going to be dead soon no matter what we may attempt. But when faced with our own extinction, fully aware that it probably won't change a thing, we're holding out hope until the very end because that's what people do. He's like, humanity is resilient and will fight till the bitter end. And a robot would give up when it's projected that it statistically wouldn't count. I'm like, yes, show him up, Ochanomizu. I love it. I love it. And then they just leave him and he just sits back in his chair, Gendo style, with the light upon him. And that's like the last we ever see of him. So meanwhile, the teddy bear is just like, oh yeah, I'll protect you in this cell if you become my slave. And he's like, sure. I'm like, okay. So we have a crack in the earth. Adam goes down in there and then him and Pluto fight till the bitter end. And then he saves Adam's life by taking on the bomb formula so that he can disengage it. Which it's like, all right, see how we go. See how we do. And then that's the end of it. And it manifests in a way in which two separate metals, they manage to like cancel each other out and create this beautiful like aurora borealis looking like field of flowers. I do like that shot of Sahad at the end, that he got his field of flowers saving the earth. That's very sweet. I like that. And I really like Tenma like with the tears in his, or not Tenma, but with Adam with the tears in his eyes. Pluto's body, but Sahad in all the ways that mattered. Meanwhile, Tenma's back in the comfort of his home, watching the aurora borealis by himselfsies. I wish that he'd gotten to see Adam one more time, because I feel like while it is kind of Tenma's comeuppance that he ends up alone, because that's kind of what he's done to himself, he's isolated himself, I do wish that Adam could have gotten to talk to him, but I'm assuming that, you know, fan fiction wise, we can make that happen, right? Meanwhile, the president of Thracia is like, I just wanted to protect our citizens. That's all. That was another thing that was very on the nose that I could tell that Urasawa was like, was when the president of Thracia, when they were asking about the volcano, he was like, well, but is it going to affect us? Are we good? Are we going to be okay? Because I know that there is a huge belief, and you're not wrong, that Americans only care about themselves and we're very out of tune with what's happening to the rest of the world. It's not wrong. It's very true. There's a lot of Americans that are very selfish. They don't care about what's happening to the rest of the world. As long as they're okay, we're okay. And I think that's true of any country, though. I think a lot of countries can have people within it that only care about themselves, right? But I think it does tie back to the fact that Urasawa wrote this in 2003 during the war with Iraq. And it was kind of like, well, as long as we're okay over here, who cares what happens there? Sort of mentality that was very rampant during that time period. So that all seems to make. But what got me in this scene was, I'm sorry, it's the Shinji chair. If you've not seen Neon Genesis Evangelion, you will not understand. But if you have, this chair means everything. It's the same lighting. It's the same damn chair. It's the same position. It's all the same. I was like, oh my God, what? Just, And then, yeah, so then the president's like, oh, thanks God for protecting us. And the teddy bear's like, like, there are infinite options at my disposal to just restart this whole thing. And the president's like, why do you want to destroy the human race so badly? And he's like, can't we find a way to coexist? And here comes Brow. So Again, how the fudge brow got here, I don't understand. I'm just like, how did he like just manage to like with the lance just get himself there? How? And the robot, the child robot's like, well, just make yourself at home. For a hot second, I thought it was going to be one of those scenarios where Brow did kill the president and the child robot and him like took over the world together and they each became like a serial killer robot and a psychopathic robot took over the United States of Thracia. Stranger things have happened, but I thought that that's what it was going to do and I was like, "Ooh, this is going to have a really dark ending to it." But no, Brow takes that kindness that came with what Adam gave him, the compassion. He says, but like Adam, they have heart. And then he tore out the lance. And then the child robot's like, well, this is a letdown, Brow. And he ends up killing him. So I don't know if Brow ends up dying when he took out the lance, if that was the end of him. All the Neon Genesis references. Interesting. But yeah, and then we end the series with Adam asking the age-old question, do you ever think we'll see the end of hatred? And he's like, all of them. And we have the one horn from Pluto left. And it's just like snowing the little like ash. He's like, I don't know, but we're going to work towards that day all the same. Because yeah, it's the idea that you may not be able to destroy hatred completely. It may always be there in some aspect and it may constantly be created, but there is a way to coexist with it, just like there's a way for the robots and humanity to coexist, and it's always going to be a work in progress. Thus is the human race. So yeah, I liked Pluto. I did enjoy this series. I'm glad that I watched it. I'm glad I got to see another Urasawa creation. I'm glad that I got a little bit of Astro Boy thrown in because I've known of Astro Boy since I was a kid, but I've never watched Astro Boy, so it's good to see like a little bit of that in there as well. Is it do I like it better than Monster? No. If you've not watched Monster, you need to watch Monster. I think Monster's better. I like Monster more, and I think it's better because it has more time to flesh out its characters. It's a long series, but I think its rewards are worth it to watch it all the way through. If you don't have time for Monster, this is a nice series that has very similar themes, so it's a nice like little mini Monster if you want to, but it's not quite as up to par as Monster, sadly. But I did enjoy it a lot, and I would like to go back and look through the manga at some point and read it. But I do have the book Another Monster to look through still. And so a couple things as we finish this. One, I am going to be doing a video about Unico, which is another Tetsuka work, which coincides very nicely with the end of this series. So hopefully please give that video essay a watch. I'd like to do more video essays, but they're a lot of work. So if you want to support me, please go watch that. Even if you don't even like Unico or know what the heck it is. Most people don't seem like they know, so I would check it out. Two, I am going to be doing a live stream about Pluto as well as Monster, so you got some time to watch if you want. And it's going to be Father's Day weekend here in the US. It's either going to be June 15th or June 17th. I will let you all know closer to time, but we're going to do a live stream and talk about both series for a couple hours then, so I hope you can make it. And then finally, next week, we're going to be starting something completely different, because after this sadness and after all this hatred, your girl needs some laughs. I need some comedy, and I need it now. So next week, we'll be starting a new series that's a comedy series, which I haven't really watched on this channel, but it's a series that I've been wanting to watch for years, and I'm finally getting to it. So I hope you all join me then. But in the meantime, I look forward to your comments down below. If any of them strike my fancy, then I'll probably mention them in the live stream. But in the meantime, I hope you all have a wonderful week. Please stay safe, take care, and yeah, I'll be back next week with a new show to react to, and I'll see you then.